I didn't cry when they gave the promotion to Brian. I didn't scream, didn't throw my coffee across the break room like I'd imagined so many times before. I just nodded, smiled tightly, and clapped with everyone else like my hands weren't shaking. For 4 years, I'd been the last to leave, the first to step in when clients were irate, the one who held the glue together, as Paul once said. Apparently, glue didn't get corner offices. Before I continue narrating the story of Lauren, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Brian started 6 months ago and spent most of that time asking me how to forward emails. He was charming, I'll give him that. All polished loafers and easy grins. Quick with a joke in meetings that never seemed to land but always got laughs anyway. He once called me the brains of the operation. Right before taking credit for a strategy, I stayed up all night preparing. I thought maybe, just maybe, this would be the time the company looked past the charm and noticed the results. But when Mr. Reynolds announced his bold decision to promote Brian to head of client services, my heart didn't break. It hardened. The conference room was silent for a beat too long after the announcement. Then came the applause, scattered at first, growing until it filled the space like smoke I couldn't breathe through. I stared down at my notepad, pretending to jot something, pretending my ears weren't ringing. Brian turned to me and winked like we were in on some inside joke. The only thing I felt was shame. Later that afternoon, I found the courage to walk into Mr. Reynolds' office. "Congratulations to Brian," I said, voice even, face composed. He didn't look up from his screen, just waved his hand and muttered, "Yes, well deserved, isn't it?" My fingers clenched around the envelope I had planned to hand him. Instead, I turned and left, the letter still tucked in my purse, warm from the heat of my indecision. That night, I sat on my couch, wine in one hand, the resignation letter in the other. I read it over again, line by line, looking for a reason not to send it. I had no backup plan, no job lined up, and rent wasn't going to pay itself. But something inside me was changing, something brittle that had finally snapped. I didn't want to survive this place anymore. I wanted to be done with it. The next morning, I dressed with purpose. No beige slacks or soft sweaters. Today, I wore navy with sharp lines, red lipstick, and the earrings my mother had given me when I got my first job. My heels clicked with intention down the hallway. I held my head high as I walked past Brian, who greeted me with a too-wide smile and a thumbs up. "Big things coming," he said with a wink. I smiled back, calm and cool. "Absolutely," I replied, placing the sealed envelope on Mr. Reynolds' desk before he arrived. My hands didn't tremble. My breath didn't catch. I walked back to my office like the floor hadn't just dropped out beneath me. The waiting was worse than the decision. I answered emails, scheduled meetings, and replied to client requests like nothing had changed. My inbox filled with congratulatory emails to Brian, most CCing me, as if I'd enjoy watching the fireworks I wasn't invited to. A few colleagues poked their heads in with pitying smiles and awkward shrugs. I smiled back, not because I wanted to, but because I could. At exactly 11:06 a.m., Mr. Reynolds appeared at my doorway. He held the letter in his hand, the seal broken, the pages creased. "Can I have a word?" he asked, eyes narrow and jaw tight. I stood, straightened my skirt, and followed him without a sound. The walls seemed thinner that day. Inside his office, he gestured to the chair opposite his desk, the one where he once praised me for saving a sinking project. "This is unexpected," he said, tapping the letter with his finger. "You're one of our most valuable team members." I said nothing. He cleared his throat. "Is this about Brian?" My silence was answer enough. "Look, promotions are complicated. It's not always about tenure or even performance. There's a lot to consider." My lips curled into something that resembled a smile, but wasn't. "There's nothing complicated about being passed over for someone who can't even spell logistics without autocorrect," I said, my voice flat. He blinked, clearly unused to hearing that tone from me. "I've trained every person on that floor, including him. I've handled more crises than I can count, and I've never once missed a deadline. But apparently, I lack executive presence." Quote. He leaned back in his chair, lips pursed. "We don't want to lose you." I looked around the office, at the awards, the polished bookshelves, the view he never earned but inherited. "You already have," I said simply. Then I stood. I didn't slam the door on my way out, didn't make a scene, didn't look back to see if Mr. Reynolds had finally realized what he'd lost. I walked to my office with the grace of someone who had nothing left to prove. My phone buzzed with meeting invites I would no longer attend, reminders that no longer applied to me. Brian walked by again, sipping an energy drink, humming something off-key and infuriatingly cheerful. I wanted to laugh at the irony. He didn't even know the storm that was brewing right over his smug little head. By lunch, the email had gone out. "Please join me in wishing Lauren Simmons the best in her future endeavors." Mr. Reynolds had typed, keeping it vague and sterile. The replies poured in, peppered with phrases like, "So sorry to see you go," and "Who will keep us sane now?" My favorite came from Kevin in IT. "Guess the ship's finally sinking without the anchor." I replied to each with a thank you, nothing more. The building seemed smaller somehow as I walked through it one last time. I stopped at the break room, took down the framed quote I'd hung on my first day, "Work hard in silence. Let success make the noise." It felt more like a warning now than a mantra. I emptied my desk slowly, like each drawer held a chapter of a book I was no longer writing. When I was done, the space looked unfamiliar, hollow, like I'd never been there at all. As I left, HR insisted on walking me out. "Policy," they said, though I'd never seen it enforced when the guys in sales left. At the elevator, I shook Janet's hand, thanked her for everything, and meant it. She'd been the only one who remembered my birthday every year. "You'll land on your feet," she whispered, her eyes a little too shiny. The elevator doors closed, sealing me off from the world I'd once thought I needed. The ride down was quiet, except for my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I stepped out into the lobby, blinking at the sunlight filtering through the tall glass windows. Outside, the city buzzed like nothing had changed. But everything had, at least for me. I walked 2 blocks to the cafe where I always went when I needed to breathe. It was half empty, the midday lull giving me a booth to myself by the window. I ordered a cappuccino and a croissant, then pulled out my notebook, the leather one I saved for the important things. On the first page, I wrote, "Start again," this time for me. The pen felt heavier than usual, but the words flowed anyway. For the first time in years, I didn't feel tethered to anyone's expectations. I wasn't the reliable one, the fixer, the backup plan, who always covered for someone else's mistakes. I was just Lauren. No titles, no roles, no corner office dreams. Just a woman sitting in a cafe, deciding what came next. I spent the afternoon making lists, not of tasks or deadlines, but of things I'd forgotten to dream about. Take a painting class. I wrote, visit Italy before 35. Start that nonprofit you never stopped thinking about. Each bullet point felt like a match struck in a dark room. When I finally got home, my apartment felt different too. I had always seen it as temporary, a place to sleep between meetings and missed birthdays. Now it was quiet and mine. No deadlines haunting the walls. I kicked off my heels, sat on the couch, and let myself cry, not because I was sad, but because I was finally free. The tears came soft and slow, like a thaw. That night, I cooked for the first time in weeks. Nothing fancy, just pasta and sautéed vegetables. But I seasoned it with care and poured a glass of wine. I lit a candle at the table, even though it was just me, and played jazz softly in the background. It felt like reclaiming a part of myself I'd handed over in pieces to that office. I didn't need applause or titles to feel like I mattered. The next morning, I opened my laptop and stared at the blank screen. I could update my resume, reach out to contacts, maybe even apply for something safe, but I didn't move for a long time. Instead, I wrote a new letter, not a resignation, but a story. I called it The Day I Remembered I Was Enough. By the end of the week, I had posted it anonymously in a professional women's forum. It wasn't polished, and it wasn't trying to be. It was raw, honest, and strangely cathartic. The responses trickled in at first, then flooded. Hundreds of women commented with stories so painfully similar I could have written them myself. One woman wrote, "This is my story, except my Brian was named Mark." Another said, "I quit last year and still regret not saying anything. Thank you for saying it for me." I read every comment with a hand over my heart, stunned by how universal the betrayal felt. Apparently, we were all just waiting for permission to stop smiling through injustice. And I had given some of them that permission without even meaning to? By Monday, the post had gone viral. A journalist from a workplace equity newsletter reached out, asking if I'd be open to an interview. "I think what you wrote could spark a bigger conversation," she said. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to be the face of a movement I hadn't intended to start. But then I thought about the silence in that conference room and how I'd clapped for a man who never earned it. "Yes," I said, voice steady. "I think it's time someone said it out loud." The article was published 3 days later under the headline, "The Day I Remembered I Was Enough. One Woman's Quiet Exit from Corporate Betrayal." They kept my name anonymous as requested, but the story was mine in every sentence. The writer had quoted me carefully, preserving the emotion without adding fluff or exaggeration. Within hours, LinkedIn messages poured in, some offering jobs, others sharing similar wounds. I hadn't expected to be seen. Not like this. Not by thousands of strangers. One message stood out, though, buried beneath the recruiters and sympathetic peers. It was from Claire Hastings, Director of People and Culture at Lorne & Maxwell, a consultancy firm I'd admired for years. "Saw your story," she wrote. "We've been looking for someone with your voice and experience. Are you open to a conversation?" I read it 3 times before answering. We scheduled a call for the following morning, and I spent the night pacing my living room, rehearsing answers to questions I wasn't sure would be asked. I researched the company again, though I already knew their reputation for nurturing talent was legitimate. I thought about the way they promoted internally, about the flexible leadership models they championed. It felt like a dream I'd forgotten I was allowed to want. When Claire's face popped up on Zoom the next morning, her smile was easy, genuine. "I know you didn't share your name in the article," she said, "but someone on our team recognized your writing style from a guest blog you once wrote on strategic project management." I laughed, startled that anyone remembered something so niche. "It stuck with us," she said, "because it was so human. We need more of that here." I blinked away the unexpected sting of tears. Our conversation lasted nearly an hour, drifting from work philosophy to the kind of culture we both believed in. Claire didn't ask why I left my last job, she asked what I'd learned from it. "Too often, companies confuse compliance with loyalty," she said. "But we're looking for leadership with integrity." When we hung up, she said she'd speak to the board about creating a role that matched what I could bring. I didn't dare hope. But I couldn't quite stop myself either. The following Monday, Claire emailed me again. "We've created a new position, Director of Strategic Culture and Client Integration. It's yours if you want it." I stared at the offer letter attached to her message, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The salary was generous, the benefits humane, and the role, well, the role was a love letter to every part of myself I thought corporate life had buried. I accepted before fear had a chance to talk me out of it. I called my sister that evening, pacing in front of the window with the phone pressed to my ear. "You did what?" she gasped after I told her the title. "Lauren, that's incredible. Didn't you say Lorne & Maxwell is the company you used to dream about joining?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "It's real, Em," I whispered. My sister screamed so loudly into the phone that I had to hold it away. "You've always been the strong one," she said after calming down. "You just forgot for a while." We talked for hours that night, the way we used to when we were kids, whispering secrets under the covers with a flashlight. Except now the secrets were dreams, reborn and possible. I slept deeply that night, the kind of sleep that felt like a door had finally closed. My first day at Lorne & Maxwell didn't feel like walking into a job. It felt like walking into myself, into the version of me that I'd always wanted to be. The office was sleek but welcoming, filled with light and laughter, with people who didn't pretend to be too busy to smile. Claire introduced me to the team with a warmth that made my cheeks flush. No power plays, no posturing, just an open seat and an invitation to fill it. By week 2, I was leading onboarding strategy for high-touch clients who'd struggled with fractured communication. "Your insights from your previous company are invaluable," Claire told me during a debrief. You understand the human layer in a way that most analysts overlook. I wanted to hug her but settled for a grateful nod. After years of being the background support, I was being asked to lead, to shape, to be the voice in the room. I found myself growing protective of this company, this culture I hadn't built but already believed in. I caught myself staying late, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to finish what I started. Every small win felt earned, not extracted. I wrote a proposal for a cross-functional mentorship program one night after dinner, and Claire approved it the next day. She didn't shelve it for later. She called it visionary and asked me to present it to the board. 3 months in, I received a package at my apartment. It was from my former coworker, Elise, one of the few people at my old job who had treated me with consistent kindness. Inside was a copy of a leadership book I'd once lent her, a handwritten note tucked into the front. You were never the glue, she wrote. You were the foundation. Without you, they're cracking. I didn't know what was happening at my old company, and I didn't really care to, but curiosity was a hard thing to kill. Later that night, I opened LinkedIn and searched for the company profile. Their post, congratulating Brian, was still up, now buried under comments questioning their hiring decisions. A few even mentioned how client accounts had started to slip. Still, I didn't feel vindicated. Not really. Just sad, maybe, that they couldn't see what they had until it was gone. But more than that, I felt grateful that I had finally stopped asking for crumbs at tables that were never meant to feed me. Now, I sat at a table I'd helped set, in a room where my voice didn't echo. It landed. 2 weeks later, I received a LinkedIn message that made me pause mid-scroll. It was from Brian. Hey, Lauren. Hope you're doing well. Any chance we could catch up soon? Got something I'd like to run by you. I stared at the screen, stunned by the audacity. The message didn't come with an apology or even a hint of acknowledgement for what had happened. Just a casual reach out, like we were old friends and not former coworkers divided by betrayal. I didn't respond right away. I needed to process what he could possibly want. After all, the last time I saw him, he was grinning across a conference room table while being handed a title I'd earned. Whatever he was looking for now, it couldn't be innocent. That evening, I mentioned it to Claire while we were reviewing project timelines. She raised an eyebrow, tapping her pen against the table. Brian? She repeated, and I nodded. Well, either he's lost something or he wants something. I smirked. Probably both. Out of curiosity, I did some quiet digging. Elise still worked at my former company and had kept in touch sporadically through occasional emails. I asked how things were going and got a reply within 10 minutes. Lauren, she wrote, everything's a mess. Brian lost the Simmons account, fumbled 2 client renewals, and apparently has no idea how to manage a quarterly review. My heart didn't leap with joy the way I thought it might. I wasn't rooting for their downfall. I was just relieved to know I'd left when I did. Elise continued, Reynolds has been in damage control mode, but it's not working. The team is overworked, clients are leaving, and there's talk of bringing in outside consultants. The irony made me laugh into my tea. I didn't reply to Brian until the next morning. Hi, Brian, I typed. Hope all is well. I'm quite busy these days, but I'm curious. What exactly do you need to run by me? It was polite, cool, and gave nothing away. He responded an hour later with a longer message. Things have gotten a bit overwhelming, he admitted. I've been thinking a lot about the systems you had in place, wondering if you'd be open to a quick call to walk me through how you handled client escalations and internal workflows. Your efficiency was unmatched. I read the message twice, letting each word settle like dust on glass. So this was it. He wanted the map to a territory he'd taken by force. I didn't owe him anything, and yet part of me wanted him to hear what I had to say. Not for revenge, not out of spite, but for clarity. I crafted my response carefully, making sure every word fit like a blade in velvet. Brian, I appreciate the message, but I'm no longer available to support systems I wasn't respected enough to be trusted with when it mattered. I hit send and exhaled. The freedom in that small act was larger than any speech I could have made in that office. Claire peeked her head into my office an hour later and asked why I looked like I'd just finished a marathon. Because, I said, I think I finally did. 3 days passed before I got another message. This one from Mr. Reynolds himself. "Lauren," it began. "I know things didn't end ideally between us, but I'd appreciate a conversation if you're willing. We're at a point where your insight could be immensely valuable. Let me know if you'd consider a short call." I stared at the message, stunned not by his request, but by the quiet desperation woven between the lines. This was the same man who once dismissed my contributions in favor of a fresh face. The same man who'd reduced my resignation to a vague goodbye email. And now, here he was, asking for guidance from the woman he had overlooked. I showed the message to Claire, who raised her eyebrows and said, "That's something." I laughed, but it came out as a sigh. I drafted a reply, but I didn't send it right away. I needed to know what I wanted out of this, if anything. I wasn't bitter anymore, not really. But I had no desire to become their fixer again. That role was retired, buried with the desk nameplate I never took home. That night, I talked it over with my sister Emily during one of our regular FaceTime calls. She wore her pink robe and sipped tea like we were 20 again. "Honestly," she said, "I'd tell them thanks, but no thanks. They had you. They wasted you. Let them learn the hard way." I smiled at her bluntness, always one of her best traits. "I don't want to gloat," I said. "It's not about that." She nodded, eyes softening. "Then just be honest. If it doesn't serve your peace, it's not your responsibility." So, I finally replied to Mr. Reynolds the next morning. "I appreciate the outreach," I wrote, "but I've moved forward with opportunities that reflect the value I bring to the table. I hope your team finds the support it needs. Best wishes, Lauren Simmons." No more, no less. That message was the period at the end of a very long sentence. I didn't need closure. I'd already given it to myself. I didn't need validation. I was living proof of my own worth. The silence that followed was confirmation enough. No apology, no explanation, and most importantly, no more chains. 2 weeks later, I was reviewing a client engagement report when Claire knocked lightly on my door. She stepped in with a slight grin, holding her tablet and an expression I hadn't seen before, something between curiosity and mischief. "You'll never guess who reached out this morning," she said, sitting across from me. "Reynolds?" I asked, already bracing. "Close," she replied, turning the tablet around to show me a forwarded email, this time from Alden, the CEO of a boutique investment firm I'd worked with during my final year at my old job. Alden had been one of my favorite clients, demanding but fair, always appreciative when someone actually followed through. The email was brief. "I understand Lauren Simmons is now with your organization. I'd like to move our business portfolio under her care, if possible." Claire tilted her head. "Seems like you've got a fan." I smiled despite myself. Claire told me she'd already approved the transition and scheduled an onboarding call for the following Monday. "He specifically asked for you," she said. "Said he hadn't found anyone with your level of clarity since you left your last post." It wasn't just flattering, it was grounding. Proof that I hadn't imagined the value I brought, even if others had refused to see it. On Monday, Alden appeared on screen during our video call with the same sharp suit and narrowed eyes I remembered. "Lauren," he greeted. "Finally, someone in leadership I can trust to think further than next quarter." I laughed and said, "I missed working with people who know what they're doing." He smirked and replied, "That's why I followed you here." The ease between us hadn't changed, but now I didn't feel like I had to earn my place in the room. As the weeks passed, more former clients began requesting me by name. Each time it felt like a small piece of my past validating the present I was building. My calendar filled up quickly, not with dread, but with energy. I found myself leading initiatives I once only dreamed of, and my mentorship program was now being adapted by other departments. For the first time in my career, my ideas didn't just live in notebooks. They moved people. One morning, as I was heading into a leadership sync, Claire pulled me aside. "The board wants to formally recognize your work with the client integration project," she said, her voice warm. "They're adding a new seat at the strategy table. They'd like you to take it." I paused in the hallway, stunned. "You're not serious," I said, and she only smiled wider. "I'm very serious," she said. "They're calling it the VP of Experience Strategy. It's yours if you want it." My breath caught as I realized this was the kind of offer I used to fantasize about, sitting at my old desk, waiting for someone else's name to be called. I nodded, words failing me. Claire laughed and said, "I already knew your answer." That night, I told Emily during our weekly video chat, and she actually screamed again. "VP!" she yelled, nearly spilling her tea. "Lauren, you're living the actual glow-up." I blushed, laughing. "I guess I am." We toasted virtually, her with her mug of chamomile and me with a glass of red wine. "You know," Emily said, "you haven't talked about the old place in weeks." I hadn't realized it until she said it, but it was true. The shadow that had followed me out of that building had finally faded. "I don't need to anymore," I said softly. Later that month, Horizon Tech announced my promotion on their public page with a simple, elegant post. "Congratulations to Lauren Simmons, our new VP of Experience Strategy, whose leadership continues to shape the future of client relations at Horizon." The comments rolled in fast. Colleagues, new clients, even a few former ones. Elise wrote, "Still rooting for you from the sidelines. They should have seen this coming." I didn't reply to the comment, but I read it twice. Elise had always understood what I was capable of, even when the rest of the company couldn't see past my quiet consistency. She once told me that leadership isn't loud, it's steady. I carried her words with me into every meeting, every strategy session. Now, I was being heard without ever having to raise my voice. One afternoon, I found myself walking past a glass-walled conference room where our CEO, Marcus, was hosting a strategy session with the board. I was on my way to another meeting, but he waved me in, smiling. "Lauren," he said, "perfect timing. We were just discussing how we can better scale the mentorship framework you introduced." He gestured to a seat at the table. "Join us?" I took the seat, feeling the weight of what it meant, not as a token, not as a courtesy, but as someone expected to contribute. As the conversation unfolded, I realized I wasn't intimidated anymore. These weren't rooms I had to prove I belonged in. They were rooms I was building. Later that week, Claire and I were walking back from a lunch meeting when she stopped me just outside the elevator. "You know," she said, "when I read your story that first time, I thought, this woman's not just capable, she's catalytic." I blinked at her. "Catalytic?" I asked. "You change things," she said simply. "You don't force it. You just walk into a place and it shifts. People recalibrate around your steadiness." I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled and thanked her. But her words stayed with me all day. That weekend, I finally opened the small box I'd moved from my old office but never unpacked. Inside were 3 paperweights, a half-used notepad, and a photo of me and Elise at a holiday party, one of the only times I'd truly smiled at that job. I stared at it for a moment, then tucked it back in the box. It wasn't bitterness that made me close it again. It was peace. Before I narrate what happens next, kindly let me know if you have any questions so far and why you haven't subscribed yet. A month into my new VP role, the annual Women in Leadership Summit sent an invitation to Horizon's executive team. Marcus forwarded it to me with a note. "Would you consider representing us on the executive panel?" I reread the email 3 times before answering. I'd never spoken at an event that large, let alone as a representative of an entire company. But then I thought of all the women who had messaged me after that anonymous article. Women still stuck in rooms that refused to hear them. "Yes," I replied, nerves bubbling under the surface. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing, working through talking points and reworking them until they felt honest. My presentation wasn't flashy. It was grounded, personal, and full of the quiet power I'd finally learned to own. Claire reviewed my draft slides and smiled. "It's not loud," she said, "but it's going to echo." The day of the summit, the auditorium was filled with hundreds of professionals from all industries. I watched speakers before me, some commanding, some inspiring, a few clearly reading for the first time. When it was my turn, I stepped on stage with my palms open, not clenched. The lights were bright, but I focused on one thing, the truth. I began not with credentials, but with a moment. "I once sat in a conference room and applauded for the man who got the job I built," I said calmly. That day, I realized my silence wasn't noble. It was invisible. A hush fell across the room. I told them about the letter I wrote, the one that ended my old chapter and began the life I have now. I didn't name names, but the story didn't need specifics to resonate. When I finished, the applause felt real, not obligatory. I saw faces shining with tears and heads nodding with recognition. Backstage, a woman in a navy blazer gripped my hands tightly. "You said everything I've been too afraid to admit," she whispered. Another said, "You didn't just talk about change. You lived it. That's rare." I thanked them both, stunned by how healing it felt just to be heard. That evening, I returned home to a bouquet of yellow roses waiting on my doorstep. The card was unsigned but handwritten in familiar script. "For the voice you found and the lives it will change. An old friend." My heart skipped a beat, but no name came. I suspected Elise, though I never asked. The summit had ripple effects I hadn't expected. Over the next week, my LinkedIn inbox overflowed again, this time with invitations to contribute to leadership podcasts, to sit on industry boards, to mentor women navigating toxic workplaces. I didn't accept them all, but I chose the ones that aligned with what mattered. No longer chasing prestige. I was building purpose. Every decision had to serve that now. One afternoon, Claire asked me to join her for coffee in the building's rooftop garden. "There's something you should know," she said, her voice careful but light. "We've been approached by a firm interested in a long-term partnership. They're asking for you specifically." I raised an eyebrow, curious. She handed me a folder, and when I saw the logo, I nearly dropped it. It was the firm where Brian now worked, my old company's latest desperate attempt at outsourcing stability. "They lost several more clients last quarter," Claire explained. "Apparently, someone high up mentioned your name during a strategy meeting, and they now want Horizon's help rebuilding their internal structures." I took a slow breath. "They want us to fix the mess I left behind." Claire looked at me with gentle concern. "I wanted to check with you before we moved forward." I nodded, heart pounding but not with fear. "Let's schedule the first meeting. I'm not going to avoid the past. I'm going to confront it." The initial call was set for Friday morning. As I reviewed the agenda and opened the video conference, a familiar face filled the screen. Brian. His expression was tight, polite, and only slightly strained. "Lauren," he said stiffly, "thank you for making the time." I gave him the same smile I once used in board meetings when pretending to be impressed. "Of course," I replied smoothly. "Let's talk about where your processes are breaking down." We dove into logistics, performance metrics, client retention trends. I kept my tone neutral, professional, and unwavering. He fumbled over answers more than once, clearly unprepared for a room where charm couldn't carry the weight. Midway through, I asked, "What are you currently using to track client satisfaction over time?" He hesitated, then admitted they'd reverted to outdated manual spreadsheets. I didn't react, but I felt Claire tense beside me. "We can help design a model for real-time analysis," I offered. "If you're ready to actually use it." Brian blinked. Yes, that would be helpful." I knew what he wasn't saying. I knew he remembered sitting in my old office, brushing off that exact suggestion 3 years ago. And now here we were, him asking for the same guidance he once refused to respect. The symmetry of it all was almost poetic. After the call, Claire turned to me. "You were surgical," she said, eyes wide. "I mean that in the best way possible." I exhaled, realizing how much tension I'd been holding. "I just did what I always do," I said. This time, someone was finally paying attention. The next day, Elise called me for the first time in months. "I heard you're consulting with them," she said softly. "Word got around quick." I laughed. "Small industry," she sighed. "I hope you know what you're doing." "There's still rot in those walls." I did know. I wasn't walking back into that place to be vindicated or validated. I was walking in as someone they could no longer afford to overlook. This wasn't a return. It was a reckoning. And for once, I had the upper hand. The first in-person consultation took place 2 weeks later, in the very office building I had walked out of months earlier. Everything looked the same. Same sterile lobby, same abstract art on the walls, same receptionist with the same tight smile. But something was different, and it wasn't just the badge clipped to my lapel that now read Horizon Tech VP. It was the way people looked at me, no longer with polite dismissal, but with wary respect. Power changes the air around you, and I could feel it thick in that building. Claire and I were escorted to the executive conference room by a junior analyst I didn't recognize. As we walked past the row of glass-walled offices, a few familiar faces peeked out, some surprised, some avoiding eye contact entirely. Elise had warned me that morale was low and turnover high, but seeing it was something else. There were fewer people in the bullpen, and the energy felt stagnant, like a department holding its breath. I remembered once believing I could fix this place from the inside. Brian entered the room 5 minutes late, carrying a stack of reports and wearing a suit that didn't quite fit. "Thank you for being here," he said, gesturing for us to sit. Claire took the lead, opening our deck and walking through Horizon's standard diagnostic process. I stayed quiet at first, observing how the others in the room deferred to Brian with hesitation, not confidence. Halfway through the session, he turned to me and said, "Lauren, would you walk us through how you managed quarterly forecasting?" I leaned forward slightly, meeting his gaze. That would have depended on what I had access to: clear data, honest reporting, and internal alignment. I said calmly, "Did those things exist at the time?" There was an awkward silence, and a project lead near the window looked down at his notebook. Brian cleared his throat and muttered, "Not consistently." I nodded once, then opened my tablet and began. We spent the next hour rebuilding the very system that had been discarded when I left. I laid out frameworks, shared templates, explained communication ladders, every tool they had once ignored. It was surreal, speaking the same truths in the same room, but now being heard. I wasn't bitter, but I wasn't gentle either. This was business, and I treated it as such. After the session, Brian lingered as the rest of the team dispersed. "You were always good at this," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I didn't realize how much until you were gone." I packed up my things slowly, choosing my words carefully. "That's the thing about being underestimated," I said. "People don't notice what you hold together until it all falls apart." Claire and I walked out in silence until we reached the car. "You handled that with restraint I don't think I possess," she said, unlocking the passenger door. I exhaled through a laugh. "It's not restraint," I told her, "it's practice." Years of swallowing disrespect had made my tolerance high. But those days were over. The following week, I received an email from Elise. "Rumor is Brian's been asked to step down," she wrote. "The board thinks they need someone with real leadership experience now." She didn't say more, but the implication was clear. My presence had shifted the power dynamics, and the old guard was starting to topple. I didn't rejoice, I just kept moving. At Horizon, things were only accelerating. Our mentorship model had been implemented across 3 departments, and turnover had dropped by 40%. I was invited to join an internal innovation committee, tasked with shaping the next 5 years of Horizon's client approach. During our first meeting, Marcus looked at me and said, "Lauren, I want you to lead this team." I hesitated for half a second, then nodded. It wasn't about ambition anymore. It was about building something that wouldn't crumble when someone like Brian walked in. I spent hours drafting our foundational strategy: empathy-based leadership, feedback systems that actually looped, promotion pathways that weren't just lip service. My calendar filled with back-to-back sessions, but for the first time, the work didn't drain me. It energized me. I wasn't fixing a broken system. I was designing a better one. There's a difference, and it matters. One Friday, as I was packing up for the weekend, I received a call from a blocked number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Lauren," came the familiar voice. It was Mr. Reynolds. I was hoping we could speak privately. I paused, unsure if I even wanted to hear what he had to say. "I'm listening," I said flatly. "I heard you were consulting with us," he began. "And I've been watching the shift. It's hard not to. I wanted to apologize for how things ended, for not recognizing what you brought to the company." It was a strange moment, hearing him say the words I had once begged for silently. "Thank you," I said, keeping my tone even. But you didn't just fail to recognize me. You actively chose not to. He sighed audibly. I did, he admitted, and I regret it. We talked for 10 more minutes, mostly about transitions and regret and how difficult it had been since I left. I let him say his piece, then ended the call with a simple take care. I didn't owe him forgiveness, and I didn't offer it. But I did offer truth. Because I wasn't trying to win anymore. I already had. That weekend, Emily came to visit, and we walked the old trail behind my building. So, she asked, what's next for you, VP of everything? I laughed, brushing a leaf from my coat. I don't know, I said honestly, but for once I'm not chasing anything. I'm just choosing. She nudged my shoulder. You've come a long way from crying over that letter at your kitchen table. I smiled, thinking of that letter still tucked away in my drawer. I have, I said, but I think I needed to cry that night. I think it broke the last thread holding me to a life I'd already outgrown. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we walked in silence. I felt no urgency, no unfinished business tugging at my heels. My past had finally stopped defining me, and my future no longer scared me. I was no longer trying to be seen. I was walking forward, fully seen, fully chosen, and finally whole. The following Monday began with a boardroom meeting that would shape the company's next fiscal year. Marcus wanted Horizon Tech to expand into 3 new markets, and he'd asked me to draft the framework. As I laid out the plan, I could feel the weight of every eye on me, not in skepticism, but in trust. Each bullet point I presented was met with nods, follow-up questions, real engagement. I wasn't auditioning for approval anymore. I was directing progress. After the meeting, Marcus pulled me aside near the elevators. Lauren, your clarity is unmatched, he said, glancing down at his notes. This expansion initiative, if we follow your lead, it's going to define Horizon's next decade. I didn't blush or deflect like I might have months ago. I looked him in the eye and said, then let's build it right. By Friday, I was spearheading the expansion team, leading a diverse group of directors who brought energy and precision. We had weekly check-ins, and each one buzzed with momentum. People weren't afraid to speak up in my meetings because they knew I actually listened. It was a team built on mutual respect, not hierarchy. For the first time in years, my work felt like it mattered beyond a quarterly report. One afternoon, I noticed a new name on our client onboarding list, Deline Group, a boutique firm I remembered from my time at my old company. They had left under complicated circumstances, fed up with mismanaged handoffs and empty promises. Now they were requesting Horizon Tech, and more specifically, me. I reached out to schedule a discovery call, and the founder, Rosa Deline, picked up herself. I heard you'd made the move, she said, her voice clipped but not cold. Took us a while to catch up, but we'd rather be late than wrong. We scheduled the call, and during our conversation, Rosa was frank. When we left your former employer, I told myself we wouldn't trust another firm again, she said. But your name kept coming up. Clients say you don't just listen, you deliver. I smiled, not out of pride, but recognition. I try to solve problems before they become excuses, I said. She laughed, a short, knowing sound. Exactly the kind of person we need. By the end of the week, Rosa had signed a full-service contract with Horizon Tech. Our team celebrated with champagne and a catered lunch, and I received an unexpected note from Rosa. Thanks for making it feel safe to hope again. I kept that card on my desk, next to the photo of Emily and me from the hiking trail. Claire stopped by my office one morning, coffee in hand, and leaned against the doorframe. You're becoming something of a legend around here, she said with a grin. People are starting to say you're the architect of this company's next chapter. I raised an eyebrow, amused. Let's not get dramatic, she laughed. Too late. That weekend, Emily surprised me with a scrapbook she'd started, filled with photos and screenshots. My summit appearance, client testimonials, even the article that had started it all. I figured you'd never make one yourself, she said, setting it on my coffee table. But I want you to see what you've done. I flipped through it slowly, overwhelmed by how far I'd come. It's weird seeing it all in one place, I whispered. She nodded, tears in her eyes. You used to call me just to ask if quitting would ruin your life. I laughed, wiping my eyes. Turns out it saved it. We toasted with takeout and old movies, the kind of evening that reminded me who I'd been before career ambition consumed me. The next few weeks passed in a blur of growth. We secured 2 more major contracts, launched the mentorship model company-wide, and even began internal interviews for a publication Marcus wanted to release titled The Horizon Standard. Claire asked if I'd write the foreword. "You've become the voice people trust," she said. "It should start with you." I agreed, surprised at how natural it felt to speak from the front. The first draft of the foreword took me longer than expected, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to say it right. I started with the moment I left my old job, the silence of that elevator ride, the letter in my bag, the way my heels echoed like punctuation down the marble floor. I wrote about reclaiming my voice, about choosing self-respect over comfort, and I wrote about what leadership should look like, not just results, but recognition. I submitted the draft and received a reply from Marcus within the hour. "This is everything I hoped it would be." A few days later, I received a LinkedIn message from Elise again. "Brian's officially out," she wrote. "The board let him go after another failed quarter." I stared at the message for a long moment, not quite knowing what to feel. Elise added, "They brought in someone new, external hire. First thing she asked about was the client retention framework you built years ago." There was something oddly poetic about it, knowing they were finally turning to what I had offered all along. Elise signed off with, "I'm glad you didn't wait for them to get it right." I typed back a single line, "Me too." And for the first time, I knew I didn't need any other closure. Spring came early that year, and the rooftop garden at work began to bloom with color. I found myself eating lunch there more often, alone sometimes, just thinking. It was quiet, but not in a lonely way, in a full content way. I watched teams laugh on picnic benches, interns scribble notes between bites, and senior staff actually smile like they belonged. Horizon Tech wasn't perfect, but it was whole. Emily visited again near the end of the quarter, and we took a walk through the city market. "You seem settled," she said, pausing to admire a pottery stand. "Peace looks good on you." I smiled at the words, knowing how far I'd traveled to earn them. "It feels earned," I said, and she reached out to squeeze my hand. As we rounded a corner, I noticed a familiar face across the crowd. Mr. Reynolds, standing near a booth, speaking to someone I didn't recognize. He caught my eye for half a second, paused, then gave a small nod. I nodded back, not as a gesture of kindness or forgiveness, but of finality. We were no longer characters in each other's stories. By early summer, Horizon Tech's expansion was fully underway, and my days were filled with decision-making meetings, strategy planning, and unexpected moments of reflection. I was busier than ever, but it didn't feel like the kind of busy that drains you. It felt like momentum. People came to me not out of obligation, but because they trusted I would give them something of value. I led with clarity and listened without assumption. 2 things I had once been told were not leadership traits. Now they were the foundation of everything I did. Marcus invited me to a retreat that would include top leadership from our satellite offices. "You've become our blueprint," he said when handing me the itinerary. "They need to hear from you." The retreat was held at a converted vineyard outside the city, quiet and soaked in golden light. As I walked through the gates, a deep calm settled in my chest. The first evening was casual. A welcome dinner under string lights, long tables, and glasses clinking in celebration. I sat between 2 new department heads who told me they'd studied my client retention models like gospel. "It's strange meeting the person who wrote the framework." One of them joked, "You're kind of a myth at the Boston office." I laughed and told them I was very real and very fond of pasta over praise. The next day was full of breakout sessions and keynotes, and I was scheduled to speak just before lunch. As I stepped up to the front of the room, I looked out at nearly 60 faces, all waiting, pens poised, eyes locked. I told them what I wish someone had told me 10 years ago, that leadership is not about being the loudest person in the room, but the clearest, that people don't leave companies, they leave disrespect, and that no title is worth more than your peace of mind. The applause afterward was warm and sustained, but it was the quiet thank you in the hallway that stayed with me most. A woman in her 40s, eyes rimmed with tears, said, "I'm not going back to work the same on Monday. I've been shrinking for 5 years." I hugged her and whispered, "Neither did I." Later, I watched her laugh freely at lunch with people she'd just met. Sometimes, change doesn't look like a revolution. It looks like someone remembering who they are. When I returned home, Emily had left a package at my door. Inside was a frame with 2 photos. One of me in my first job interview suit at 24, and one taken from the summit earlier that year. In between them, she'd placed a typed quote that read, "She stopped asking for a seat at the table and built her own." I hung it above my desk where I could see it every morning. It reminded me not of who I had become, but of how long it had taken to believe I was allowed to become her. The industry buzz around Horizon's growth was growing louder. Competitor firms had begun trying to mimic our client-first approach, though few understood that our success wasn't in processes, it was in culture. A journalist from a major business publication reached out, asking if I'd be open to a profile. I hesitated, not out of fear, but caution. I wanted the story to be told honestly, not spun into a redemption arc or a fairy tale. The article ran under the title, "The Quiet Architect: How Lauren Simmons Reshaped Client Experience by Redefining Leadership." It was respectful, thorough, and surprisingly emotional. The writer had pulled quotes from my summit speech and interviews with colleagues, even Elise. She didn't burn bridges. Elise had said she built new ones and walked over them like she'd always known how. That line made me cry in my kitchen, forehead pressed to the counter, breath catching with quiet gratitude. Emails flooded in afterward, from strangers, former clients, even people I hadn't spoken to since college. One stood out. It was from Rosa Deline. "Read the article," she wrote. "Glad to see the world catching up to what some of us already knew." It made me realize how many people had been watching, silently cheering, even when I'd felt alone. Claire forwarded me another invitation the following week, this one from a national conference on ethical business leadership. "They want you to keynote next year," she said, handing me her tablet. "Top billing. They saw your summit speech online." I blinked at the screen, processing the weight of it. "They want me to open the whole conference," she nodded. "Your story is the proof they've been looking for, that doing things the right way doesn't mean doing them quietly." I nodded slowly, the gravity settling in. I wasn't just speaking for myself anymore. I was speaking for everyone who had ever been overlooked, undervalued, and underestimated. That night, I pulled out the original resignation letter, the one I had handed to Mr. Reynolds so many months ago. I kept it in a small box, along with my first business card and a folded napkin from the cafe I'd gone to after quitting. The letter was still crisp, words still sharp. I reread it, then set it aside and wrote a new one, not a resignation, but a message to my future self. Never shrink to fit a room you were meant to redesign. The next morning, I arrived early to the office and left that message in my desk drawer, not because I needed the reminder today, but because one day I might. Growth isn't a straight line. It loops and knots and stretches, and I wanted that version of me, whenever she came, to know she wasn't alone, that she had built something strong enough to hold her. Marcus stopped by my office that afternoon with a grin. "The governor's office called," he said casually, like he was asking about my weekend. "They're forming a task force on workforce equity and asked for you by name." I blinked. "What would I even do on a state task force?" He laughed. "Exactly what you're doing here, making people feel seen and systems feel possible." I took a deep breath, heart swelling not with pride, but with purpose. This wasn't about spotlight or ego. It was about impact. The letter I'd written all those months ago had ended one chapter, but it had started something much greater. Not just for me, but for every person who'd ever handed in their own version of that letter. And now, that story was becoming a blueprint for others to build from. The morning of the keynote, the auditorium buzzed with the kind of electricity that only comes before something important. The national conference had gathered leaders from across industries, and I stood backstage with my hands clasped, rehearsing the opening line in my head. I wore the same navy blue suit I had worn the day I handed in my resignation letter, now tailored and paired with the quiet confidence I never had back then. Claire stood beside me, adjusting her badge and smiling with that unshakable steadiness I'd come to rely on. "You ready?" she asked, though we both knew the answer. I walked out to the podium with slow, deliberate steps. The applause was generous, not frenzied, and that made it feel even more real. I took a breath and looked out at the rows of faces. Executives, new graduates, educators, HR leaders, entrepreneurs, waiting for something more than just a speech. They wanted proof that integrity could survive success. 2 years ago, I wrote a letter that changed my life. The silence in the room was immediate and respectful. It wasn't an angry letter, I continued. It was honest. It said, "Thank you for the opportunity, but I will no longer contribute to a system that profits from silencing the very people who make it work." Heads began to nod. That letter was not the end of a job. It was the beginning of a voice. I spoke about leadership that values people over optics, about the false idol of loyalty when it means enduring disrespect, about choosing to rebuild instead of beg. I told them how the industry had once taught me that being dependable made me invisible, and how now dependability was the cornerstone of the company culture I helped shape. If your organization only sees brilliance and loudness, you'll lose every quiet powerhouse you ever had. That line earned a standing ovation before I even finished. After the speech, the stage manager led me through a maze of back corridors to a lounge area. I barely had time to sit before a stream of attendees entered, some shaking my hand, some crying, many just saying thank you. A woman with graying curls and a soft green scarf leaned in and said, "I wrote my own letter last week. I haven't sent it yet, but today, I think I will." I squeezed her hand and nodded, no words needed. Later that evening, the Horizon Tech leadership team hosted a small dinner at a rooftop restaurant to celebrate. Claire raised her glass and toasted to blueprints that look like people, not policies. Marcus followed with a simple, "To Lauren, who built something we can all stand on." I was too full of emotion to say much, but I looked around the table and felt something I'd never felt in any job before: safe, known, and valued. No performance, no role to play, just presence. A few weeks after the conference, I received a thick envelope in the mail. Inside was an embossed invitation. The Business Ethics Alliance was awarding Horizon Tech with their annual Culture Catalyst Award. The letter specifically cited the client-first initiative, the mentorship model, and my keynote. I reread it twice, hands shaking slightly, and then walked it over to Claire's office. She didn't say anything, just pulled me into a hug and whispered, "You changed the game." Emily called me that night after reading the news online. "You know what's funny?" she asked. "You used to cry over performance reviews that didn't mention your name. Now you're redefining what performance even means." I laughed, the sound light and unburdened. "Turns out, I just needed to change the room." She exhaled into the phone. "No, Lauren, you became the room." That phrase stuck with me for days. It echoed when I was in meetings, when I mentored a young project lead named Hannah, who reminded me of myself at 26. It echoed when I approved hiring decisions, ensuring we didn't just bring in talent, but respected it. It echoed when Rosa Deline emailed to say her firm had doubled its revenue under Horizon's guidance and that she wanted to collaborate on a workshop together. Every little success was no longer about me alone. It was about building spaces where others didn't have to fight so hard to be seen. 6 months later, Elise reached out again. She'd finally left our old company. "I waited too long," her message read, "but your story gave me the courage to believe I wouldn't drown if I jumped." She had joined a startup that was still raw, still figuring things out, but she was leading their client experience department and loving it. "Turns out," she added, "starting over feels a lot like starting right." We met for lunch one weekend in the city, and it felt like time had folded in on itself. She looked lighter, freer, and when she thanked me again, I just shook my head. "You did this yourself," I told her. "All I did was walk first." She smiled and said, "Yeah, but you made the path visible." That might have been the highest compliment I'd ever received. Later that week, I returned to the same cafe I had visited the day I quit. It hadn't changed. The same warm wooden counters, the same chalkboard menu, the same soft jazz looping in the background. I ordered a cappuccino, found a seat by the window, and pulled out a small notebook. On the first page, I wrote, "We don't always get the justice we imagine, but sometimes we get something better. Peace." I sat there longer than usual, sipping slowly, watching the city breathe outside the glass. People hurried down the sidewalks, phones in hand, lives in motion. I used to be one of them, rushing, chasing, proving. Now, I was choosing, not just the work I did, but the way I did it, and the why behind it all. Before I left, I tucked the notebook into my bag, placed my empty cup in the bin, and walked out with a quiet smile. As I crossed the street, someone called my name, and I turned to see a former intern from my old job. "Lauren," she said, "you won't remember me, but I worked 2 cubicles down. I left last year. Your story was the push I needed. Just wanted to say thank you." I nodded and said, "I remember you." And I did, because when you walk through fire, you remember everyone who saw the smoke but stayed anyway. That night, I placed my original resignation letter back into its envelope and slid it into the scrapbook Emily had made. I added a sticky note beside it. He laughed when I quit until he read my letter. What it said wiped the smile off his face. And what came after reminded me what power sounds like. It sounds like your own voice. Thank you for listening to Lauren's story. If you're yet to subscribe, please consider doing so before watching another story on the channel.